Welcome everyone, today's story. My wife kicked us out. I covered a rusted Quonset in clay. What it became saved our lives. But don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is. Now let's get into the story. The night my wife kicked us out, the world didn't feel like it had any space for me and my 15-year-old son. The argument had been brief but sharp, a culmination of months of tension that I hadn't wanted to see, but somehow always knew was simmering beneath the surface. One moment we were sitting at the kitchen table, trying to discuss bills and the future, and the next doors were slamming, voices were raised, and I was standing on the porch holding our meager belongings, with my son trailing silently behind me. I looked at him then, noticing the way his eyes widened in fear and disbelief, and I realized just how much the world can change in the span of a single conversation. It was winter, but not the kind of winter that blankets the earth in a comforting hush. The wind had a bite to it, carrying a sharp chill that seemed to seep directly into your bones. The sky overhead was a bruised purple, heavy with clouds that promised snow, and there was no one around for miles to ask for help. We had no family nearby who would welcome us, and no friends with enough space or compassion to take in two people left suddenly homeless. All I had was a stubborn determination in the boy, who now clutched my sleeve as if letting go might mean disappearing forever. We walked along the edge of our old property, which I had almost forgotten existed. There, half hidden behind overgrown grass and a few gnarled trees, stood an old Quonset hut. It was one of those semi-cylindrical metal buildings, rusted, bent in places with a roof that had sagged under the weight of years of neglect. Most people would have walked past it and never looked back, considering it useless scrap. But I saw something else. A foundation, a shelter, a potential home if we were willing to fight for it. "Dad, it looks abandoned," my son said hesitantly, his voice trembling. "Yes, it's abandoned," I admitted, trying to inject confidence into my tone, though my gut was tight with uncertainty. "And that's exactly why it's perfect. Nobody will bother us here." He studied the hut for a long moment, then shrugged reluctantly. "I guess it's better than the cold." We didn't waste another moment. Pulling our bags along the uneven ground, we approached the hut. The door creaked when I opened it, revealing a dark interior filled with the smell of rust, damp metal, and dust. The floor was littered with debris, broken boards, old nails, and bits of insulation, but it was solid. And the walls, though thin and dented, still stood firm. I could already imagine what it could become if we just put in the effort. "First things first," I said, setting down our bags. "We clear out the junk and see what we're working with." My son and I spent the next few hours hauling debris, tossing anything that seemed dangerous or useless, and sweeping away years of accumulated dirt. By the time we finished, the hut looked like the skeleton of a house, bare but ready for life. The metal walls were cold to the touch, and the wind whistled through the gaps, reminding us that survival here would be a test of endurance. As I surveyed the hut, a wild idea struck me. "We're going to cover this with clay," I told my son. He froze. "Clay? You mean like mud?" "Exactly," I said, trying to keep my excitement from sounding crazy. "Clay is a natural insulator. It will help keep the cold out, and it's strong once it dries. We can make this place livable." His eyes widened, but there was curiosity there now, a spark I hadn't seen when we first walked out into the cold. "You really think it'll work?" "I know it will," I said, more to convince myself than him. "We have no other choice. We either figure this out or we suffer through winter, and I don't plan on letting that happen." The next day we set out to collect clay. I remembered a patch behind the old barn where the soil was thick and reddish, perfect for what I had in mind. My son and I dug through the mud with our hands, and a few old tools we'd scavenged from the shed. It was cold, sticky, and exhausting work, but there was a strange satisfaction in transforming something as simple as dirt into a building material. Back at the hut, we mixed the clay with a little water to make it pliable. I showed my son how to smear it across the metal walls, filling the gaps, layering it thick enough to insulate, but not so thick it would crack as it dried. Our hands were caked with clay, faces streaked with red mud, and we laughed at our ridiculous appearance. It was messy, exhausting, and yet it was the most alive I had felt in months. Hours turned into days. Every morning we woke, sore but determined, and continued our work. The hut began to change before our eyes. The rusty metal walls disappeared beneath smooth, reddish layers of clay. The gaps that once let in wind were sealed, and the interior slowly transformed from a freezing, echoing chamber into a warmer, welcoming space. We carved a small hearth out of clay and stones, planning to build a fire that would provide heat without filling the hut with smoke. We even made a few shelves along the walls to hold our limited possessions. During this time, I watched my son grow in ways I hadn't expected. He learned to handle the clay, to measure thickness, to understand how the material dried and hardened. He laughed more than he had in months, and occasionally, when I thought he wasn't looking, I caught him staring at the hut with pride. It wasn't just a structure anymore. It was ours, built from sweat, mud, and determination. Night times were the hardest. The cold still crept through the clay in patches that hadn't fully dried, and the wind whistled around the hut like a predator. But we learned to light small fires safely, to cover ourselves with blankets, and to tell stories that kept fear at bay. I told him about my childhood, about mistakes I had made, about dreams that hadn't worked out, hoping he would see that even when life pushes you out, you can always push back. We scavenged wood from nearby, fallen trees to reinforce the roof, and to make a small table. We collected rainwater and filtered it through cloth. Every small achievement felt monumental because it was ours, forged in desperation and determination. My son began to help plan the layout of the hut, suggesting small niches for storage, a window carved in the clay to let light in, and even a little raised bed area that would keep us off the cold ground. One evening, after a long day of work, we sat inside the hut, clay caked on our arms, muscles sore, and hands blistered. My son leaned against me and whispered, "Dad, it's kind of nice in here. I feel safe." Hearing that, I realized why I was doing all this. It wasn't just survival. It was rebuilding our lives, restoring dignity and hope. "It's not just the hut," I told him. "It's us. We're doing this together, and that's what makes it strong." By the end of the first month, the hut was nearly unrecognizable from the rusted shell it had been. The clay walls glowed red in the sunlight. The small hearth was functional, and we had even carved rudimentary benches and shelves. We were tired, but each night I lay on my side of the hut floor, listening to my son breathe evenly beside me, and felt a deep, unshakable satisfaction. We had started with nothing, but we were creating something permanent, something alive. And yet, even as I reveled in our progress, there was a shadow at the edge of my mind. This wasn't permanent. Winter was harsh, supplies were limited, and we were completely isolated. Any mistake could mean disaster. But I pushed the thought away. Worry wouldn't build the walls. Hard work would, and as long as we were together, I believed we could face whatever came next. Over the next weeks, we refined the clay application, smoothing it, layering it, testing its strength. I taught my son about natural insulation, about how clay traps heat, and how even small improvements could make a huge difference. We dug a small trench around the hut to channel rainwater away and prevent erosion. We reinforced the entrance with a makeshift wooden frame. Everything we did was laborious, slow, and sometimes frustrating, but each step forward reinforced our belief in what we were creating. Our conversations changed too. In the past, most of our talks had been about mundane school issues or fleeting hobbies. Now they were about survival, resilience, and life lessons. I told him about the importance of planning, of patience, and of seeing opportunity where others see waste. He shared his fears and hopes with me, and I realized that being cast out had brought us closer than we had ever been. By the time winter truly set in, the hut was a haven. The clay walls retained warmth, the hearth provided a cozy fire, and we had even managed to rig a small curtain for privacy. The yow. Cold still nipped at our extremities, and nights were long and dark. But we were no longer merely surviving. We were thriving in our own way. That rusted, abandoned Quonset hut had become our fortress, built not from bricks or nails alone, but from sweat, hope, and determination. I looked at my son one night, sitting cross-legged near the hearth, and felt a surge of pride. "Look at this," I said quietly. "We did it together." He smiled, dirt on his face, clay under his fingernails, eyes shining. "Yeah, together." And in that moment, I realized something important. Life doesn't stop for rejection. It doesn't pause for hardship. It moves forward, and you have to move with it. But when you face it with someone you love, someone you protect, you can turn even the most abandoned, forgotten places into a home. That first part of our journey wasn't easy. It was exhausting, frustrating, and at times terrifying. But it was also transformative. We had been kicked out, stripped of comfort, and thrown into the unknown. Yet in the face of despair, we had found strength, resilience, and a new beginning. The Quonset hut, once a forgotten relic, had become the foundation of our survival, not just physically but emotionally. The lessons of those first weeks stayed with us. Determination, creativity, and the bond between father and son could turn adversity into opportunity. And as long as we had that, we could face anything. The dawn after our first harsh winter night in the clay-covered Quonset hut came like a fragile promise. The sun struggled to pierce the thick clouds overhead, casting a muted golden glow across the snow-streaked landscape. Inside, the hut was warm enough that we could sit without shivering violently, but the chill lingered in the corners, reminding us that survival was still a daily battle. I watched my son stretch and rub his eyes, his hair messy, his face smudged with dried clay from yesterday's work. There was a quiet determination in him now, a resilience that had begun to grow from our shared labor and hardship. We had begun to settle into routines. Each day started with small tasks, gathering firewood, checking the integrity of the clay walls, and ensuring the hearth would burn steadily throughout the night. I had begun to teach my son how to manage the fire, how to control the oxygen flow, arrange kindling efficiently, and recognize the difference between wood that would burn too quickly or too slowly. These lessons were as much about survival as they were about instilling responsibility and awareness. Our supplies were scarce. We had a few tins of food left over from the house, but I knew we could not rely on them for long. I had to think ahead. We started collecting fallen branches and small logs from nearby trees. Some of the wood was wet, which made it heavier and slower to burn, but we learned to dry it near the hearth before using it. It was a tedious process, but it became meditative in its own way. Each flake of bark, each log split and stacked, represented progress, hope, and survival. The hut itself continued to evolve. I had reinforced the clay walls with additional layers, smoothing out cracks and adding small grooves to strengthen adhesion. The metal underneath still creaked and groaned under wind pressure, but the clay absorbed most of the impact. My son and I even began experimenting with small windows carved into the clay. They were covered with thin, flexible sheets scavenged from old tarps to keep the warmth in and the wind out. These windows allowed a limited but comforting light to filter in, making the space feel more like home and less like a cold, abandoned relic. Food remained a constant concern. We began foraging in the woods nearby. It was a cautious process, as I wanted to ensure we didn't consume anything poisonous or dangerous. Mushrooms, berries, and edible roots became staples in our improvised diet. My son was fascinated by the process, asking endless questions about which plants were safe, how to identify them, and how to prepare them. I taught him not just for survival, but to instill knowledge that might protect him one day, far beyond the hut. Hunting became a necessary skill. I fashioned simple traps from wire and wood, placing them along animal trails. At first, we caught little more than rodents, but as days passed, our understanding of the forest improved. We learned about patterns of movement, the smells of the wind, and the delicate balance of patience and observation. My son's eyes would light up when we found a trail, and his small hands would tremble as he helped set traps, eager to contribute. Each successful catch was a triumph, not just in food, but in our growing competence and self-reliance. Despite the practical challenges, there were moments of unexpected beauty. One morning I woke to see frost covering the clay walls, sparkling in the rising sun like tiny diamonds. My son was already awake, sketching the hut with a stick in the dirt. He had begun documenting our days in little ways, marking the number of successful hunts, the days we spent strengthening the hut, and even small sketches of the plants and animals we encountered. It struck me how resilient children could be. Even in hardship, he found a way to create and observe, to make sense of the chaos around us. Our bond deepened in ways I hadn't anticipated. I saw his fears, his frustrations, and his occasional anger, and I learned to respond with patience and understanding. We argued, of course, over small things, a mislaid tool, the way firewood was stacked, or how to handle chores, but these arguments were fleeting, quickly replaced by mutual respect and teamwork. There was a rhythm to our days, a pattern of labor, learning, and moments of rest that gave structure to our new lives. I also began teaching him practical skills beyond immediate survival. I showed him how to reinforce, clay walls with natural fibers I had gathered from fallen reeds and vines. These fibers acted like a natural rebar, increasing the durability of the clay as it dried. My son marveled at how strong the hut had become, and we experimented together, testing small sections to see how much pressure they could withstand. It was an education in resilience, in understanding materials, and in improvisation. Nighttime remained the hardest challenge. The wind howled outside, rattling the hut's clay exterior and threatening to exploit any weak spot. I would check the hearth, add logs, and ensure the small windows were properly covered. My son would watch intently, mimicking my movements, learning the patterns, and anticipating the next step. We often stayed awake late into the night, sharing stories from the past, our hopes for the future, and sometimes our regrets. These conversations were as much a survival mechanism as the fire. They kept our spirits warm when the cold could not. Occasionally we ventured beyond the immediate area around the hut, exploring the nearby woods for new resources. We found a small stream not far from our shelter, its water clean and drinkable. We constructed a makeshift filtration system using sand, gravel, and cloth, ensuring a steady supply of fresh water. My son took pride in this work, proudly explaining the filtration steps as if he had invented them himself. It was a small victory, but in a world stripped to essentials, every victory mattered. The mental and emotional challenges were ever present. Being cut off from our previous life, from friends, community, and the comfort of familiar routines tested both of us. But the hut had become more than just physical shelter. It was a symbol of our ability to adapt and endure. I began to see the power in creating something tangible from nothing. Every layer of clay, every improvised shelf or bench, every carefully stacked log was a testament to human resilience. My son began to take initiative in ways I hadn't expected. He suggested improvements to the hut's layout, helped design a small compost area to manage waste, and even experimented with rudimentary insulation techniques using leaves and grasses. Watching him problem solve, watchful of natural elements, and innovate solutions made me realize how adversity could nurture resourcefulness. It wasn't just survival, it was growth under pressure. Days merged into weeks and the seasons subtly shifted. Spring approached, and with it came the challenges of thawing snow, increased rainfall, and the potential for structural damage to the clay. I prepared for this by reinforcing the hut's base, ensuring proper drainage, and checking the walls for cracks or erosion. My son helped tirelessly, learning how to assess weak points, how to apply clay smoothly, and how to anticipate environmental pressures. Together we transformed the hut into a more permanent, livable structure. As we grew more confident in our ability to survive, I introduced small comforts. We scavenged scraps of cloth to make rudimentary bedding. We gathered wildflowers to place near the hearth. Even small rituals, like marking the completion of a week of successful survival or celebrating a catch from our hunting traps, became essential for morale. I realized then that survival was not merely about enduring physical hardship. It was about nurturing hope, creativity, and the spirit. By the time part 2 of our journey reached its midpoint, the hut was no longer merely a shelter. It had become a home, forged from determination, ingenuity, and the bond between father and son. The clay walls, hardened and reinforced, held the heat of the hearth. The small windows allowed light to penetrate the interior, while keeping the elements at bay. Outside, our small garden of edible plants began to take root, promising sustainability and growth beyond immediate survival. We had also begun to prepare for unforeseen challenges. Winter might come again, or a storm could threaten the hut. I taught my son how to monitor the weather, collect water safely during rain, and store supplies efficiently. We made small caches of food and wood, hidden strategically around the hut, ensuring that even if one supply ran out, we would have a backup. This preparation became a ritual, a practice that reinforced the lessons of resilience and foresight. Our relationship continued to deepen. We shared meals by the hearth, discussed our future, and even joked about the absurdity of our situation. Laughter became a crucial survival tool, a way to fight off despair. I watched my son grow stronger, both physically and emotionally, learning skills that would serve him far beyond our immediate circumstance. And in turn, I found strength in his courage, his curiosity, and his unwavering determination to help and contribute. Life in the clay Quonset hut was far from easy, but it was ours. We had been cast out, thrown into the wilderness without a roadmap, and yet in the process of rebuilding from scratch, we had discovered a resilience and creativity neither of us had known we possessed. The hut was more than shelter, it was proof that even in the face of rejection, even when the world turns its back, life can be rebuilt with patience, ingenuity, and unwavering dedication. As the days lengthened and spring's promise of warmth grew stronger, I realized that our survival was not merely physical. It was emotional, mental, and spiritual. We had learned to trust ourselves, to innovate, and to find joy in the small victories. The clay walls that had once been a strange, risky idea were now the cornerstone of our safety, stability, and hope. My son and I had survived winter, built a home from nothing, and discovered the depths of our own courage. And as I watched him sleep near the hearth one evening, the orange glow of the fire casting soft shadows across his clay-streaked face, I knew that no matter what came next, we were ready. Because survival was not just about shelter, food, or warmth. It was about determination, love, and the bond that keeps two people alive when the world has cast them aside. The months following the harsh winter had transformed both the hut and us in ways I could never have predicted. The clay-covered Quonset hut that had once seemed like a desperate gamble had become a stronghold, a home that embodied the sweat, determination, and ingenuity of two people who refused to surrender to circumstance. My son and I had weathered cold, hunger, and uncertainty, and in doing so, we had forged a bond that went beyond blood. It was trust, respect, and an unspoken agreement that we would protect each other no matter what. Spring had blossomed, timid at first, coaxed by the weak but persistent sun. Snow melted, streams swelled, and the landscape, once stark and lifeless, erupted with color. The forest surrounding our hut became a source of resources and, unexpectedly, comfort. The smell of damp earth, the sound of water trickling over stones, and the rustle of leaves in the wind became background music to our survival, a reminder that life continued even in the most challenging circumstances. Each morning, my son and I continued our routines, refined now by months of experience. The hearth remained the heart of our hut, both literally and symbolically. We would wake before dawn, check the fire, and add logs that we had split and dried the previous day. I taught my son the finer points of fire management, how to control airflow with careful adjustments, how to arrange wood for maximum heat efficiency, and how to recognize when a fire was too weak or too strong. He took these lessons to heart, moving with confidence and precision, and I could see the pride in his eyes when he managed the fire without my help. Our survival skills had grown exponentially. The garden we had started was now flourishing. I had taught my son to recognize plant cycles, soil conditions, and natural fertilization techniques. We had discovered which wild plants could supplement our diet, which mushrooms were edible, and which roots were nutritious. Every meal we prepared was an exercise in creativity, combining foraged items with garden produce, often cooked over the hearth in improvised cookware. My son delighted in these meals not for their luxury, but for the satisfaction of knowing we had produced something tangible from our own efforts. Hunting remained a central part of our routine. With our traps and newfound knowledge of animal behavior, we had begun catching larger game. Deer tracks became familiar and we learned to set traps along likely paths, understanding how wind direction, scent, and timing affected our success. My son was learning patience, observation, and the importance of subtlety. These skills were not just about feeding ourselves. They were about teaching him to adapt, think ahead, and respect the natural world that sustained us. Life inside the hut had become surprisingly rich. We had improved the clay walls with additional layers of reinforcement. I had begun experimenting with insulating the floor, using dried leaves and grasses, creating a soft, warm bed. We built small shelves along the walls to organize tools, food, and personal belongings. Even small decorations like wildflowers in a jar or sketches my son drew in the clay transformed the space from a mere shelter to a true home. The hut was no longer a symbol of desperation. It was a testament to our ingenuity and determination. Social isolation remained a challenge. We had no contact with the outside world, and the silence was sometimes oppressive. But this isolation also fostered introspection and deep connection. My son and I spoke about life, dreams, regrets, and the future. I shared stories from my own childhood, moments of failure and lessons learned, hoping to guide him without imposing fear. He, in turn, shared his observations, worries, and hopes for a life beyond the hut. These conversations, often long and quiet, became as essential to survival as food, water, and shelter. Weather continued to test us. Spring rains brought heavy downpours that threatened to erode our clay walls. I had anticipated this and built small channels around the hut to divert water away from the foundation. My son helped reinforce weak spots, mixing clay with additional natural fibers to strengthen the structure. Every rainstorm was both a challenge and a learning opportunity, teaching us resilience, problem-solving, and adaptability. One particularly intense storm left us trapped inside the hut for 2 days. The wind howled, rattling the walls, and rain pounded the clay in relentless sheets. Inside, we sat close to the hearth, sharing stories and conserving energy. I could see the fear in my son's eyes, but also a growing confidence. He had faced countless storms before, and he trusted that our preparations would hold. When the storm finally passed, the hut remained intact, a testament to our hard work and careful planning. During these months, I also began teaching my son practical skills beyond immediate survival. We worked with clay, experimenting with different textures and compositions to improve insulation. I showed him how to carve simple tools from wood, how to reinforce doors and windows, and even how to fashion small traps for food. He absorbed these lessons eagerly, and soon he began improvising on his own, suggesting improvements I hadn't thought of. It was remarkable to watch his confidence grow, and I realized that adversity was shaping him into a capable, resilient young man. Despite our progress, the emotional weight of being abandoned by my wife lingered. There were nights when the quiet of the hut amplified memories of rejection, of lost comfort, and of the life we had once known. On these nights, I held my son close, whispering reassurance, and we would talk about our dreams for the future, what we hoped to achieve beyond mere survival. These conversations were cathartic, allowing us to process our pain and transform it into motivation. By mid-spring, the hut was nearly unrecognizable from its original state. The clay walls were thick, smooth, and sturdy. The roof was reinforced with additional beams and layers of clay. Small windows allowed light and ventilation, while keeping the cold and rain out. The interior was organized, comfortable, and surprisingly cozy. We had benches, shelves, and a small dining area near the hearth. Even the floor, once cold and bare, was cushioned with layers of leaves, grasses, and cloth scraps, creating a space where we could rest without fear of dampness or cold. Our days were long but structured. Morning routines involved tending to the fire, checking the clay walls, and preparing breakfast from garden produce or foraged food. Afternoons were spent working on improvements, exploring the surrounding forest for resources, and maintaining our traps and garden. Evenings were quieter, filled with shared meals, conversation, and planning for the next day. These routines created stability in an otherwise unpredictable environment, providing a sense of normalcy and purpose. We also began small experiments in sustainability. I taught my son how to collect rainwater, filter it, and store it safely. We started a compost area to manage organic waste and enrich the soil in our garden. We observed wildlife patterns to improve hunting and foraging efficiency. Each step was calculated, deliberate, and aimed at ensuring long-term survival. My son's curiosity and willingness to learn made him an invaluable partner in these efforts. The bond between us deepened further during these months. We had begun to understand each other in ways that went beyond words. I could sense his moods, anticipate his needs, and guide him without being overbearing. He in turn had developed trust in my judgment, learning when to follow instructions and when to innovate on his own. Together we had created a rhythm, a partnership forged through necessity, hard work, and shared vulnerability. As spring gave way to early summer, the hut had become more than a survival shelter. It had become a sanctuary. We could rest, work, eat, and plan our future within its walls. The clay, once a mere building material, had become a symbol of resilience, creativity, and the power of human determination. Every crack filled, every layer smoothed, and every improvised improvement was a testament to our perseverance and ingenuity. We also began to notice the subtle joys of life in isolation. Morning light streaming through the clay windows, the sound of birdsong in the forest, the smell of freshly baked bread on the hearth. These simple pleasures became sources of profound happiness. They reminded us that even in hardship, life could be beautiful, and that hope could flourish in unexpected places. Our confidence grew. We began to consider long-term improvements, like expanding the hut, creating additional storage, and even experimenting with small-scale rainwater irrigation for the garden. Each idea was carefully evaluated, discussed, and implemented if feasible. This planning gave us purpose and direction, transforming survival into proactive life-building. By early summer, we had survived not just physically, but emotionally and mentally. The hut stood as a symbol of our journey, our resilience, and our ability to adapt. My son had grown into a capable, confident young man, skilled in survival, observation, and problem-solving. And I had discovered a strength within myself that I had not known existed, a combination of patience, creativity, and unwavering determination. We had been abandoned, cast out, and left to face the world alone. Yet in that very struggle, we had found life, purpose, and connection. The clay-covered Quonset hut was more than a home. It was proof that human ingenuity, love, and resilience could transform adversity into opportunity. As I watched my son sleep by the hearth one evening, the glow of the fire casting gentle shadows across his face, I realized that our journey had only just begun. We had survived winter, mastered survival, and built a home from nothing, but beyond the physical walls of our hut lay a world, filled with possibilities, challenges to face, knowledge to gain, and life to live. And in that realization, I felt a profound sense of peace. We were alive, we were together, and no matter what the future held, we would face it as we had faced every obstacle so far, with determination, creativity, and unwavering love for each other.